A wounded German shepherd, limping through the blinding snow, its fur frozen with blood and ice, had been thrown away to die in a raging winter storm. No one believed it would survive, but months later, beneath a collapsing cabin roof, the very man who saved it lay trapped. If this story touched your heart, tell me where you're listening from. Write your city or state in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. Snow had been falling since the late afternoon over Pine Ridge, Montana, the kind of slow, relentless winter storm that swallowed roads, softened the outlines of pine trees, and turned every sound into a dull whisper beneath layers of white. By the time I reached the outskirts of the valley, the sky had become a heavy gray curtain, and the wind was pushing thick curtains of snow across the ranch fields. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 52 years old, a retired Navy SEAL who learned long ago that silence can feel heavier than gunfire. I had spent 23 years in the teams, most of them in places where the air smelled of dust and cordite instead of pine and snow, and though the war had ended for me 2 years earlier, the habits it carved into my bones never really left. I moved to Pine Ridge because the mountains were quiet and the people kept to themselves, which suited a man who slept lightly and preferred the company of trees to crowds. My cabin sat alone at the edge of the national forest, a squat wooden place built decades ago by a trapper, its porch sagging slightly under the weight of snow, its chimney coughing thin trails of smoke into the cold sky. Most days I repaired fences, fixed engines, or took small jobs from ranchers who knew a former SEAL didn't ask many questions. That evening, I had driven out to the Kane Ranch to collect payment for repairing a collapsed horse stall. Victor Kane owned more land than anyone else in the valley, and liked to remind people of it. He was a tall, thick-shouldered man in his early 60s with silver hair brushed neatly back and a trimmed gray beard that tried to make him look distinguished rather than severe. His eyes were pale and flat like winter ice, and the locals often said Kane measured people the way he measured cattle, by usefulness. The ranch house glowed dimly through the snowfall when I arrived, though most of the yard lights were off, leaving long shadows stretching across the drifts. Kane stepped out onto the porch when he heard my truck engine. "Walker," he called, his voice carrying just enough irritation to suggest he had already decided the conversation would end badly for someone. I walked through the snow toward him, boots crunching, the wind biting through my jacket. "I finished the stall," I told him. "Boards reinforced, roof beam replaced." Kane gave a small nod, though his expression never softened. "I know. I checked it." For a moment I thought he might actually thank me, but instead he turned and gestured toward the far corner of the yard where a rusted metal structure sat, half buried in snow. "Payment's over there." I followed his gaze. At first, all I saw was the outline of a cage, the kind ranchers sometimes used for trapping coyotes, its bars crusted with frost. Then something moved inside it. I walked closer, pushing through knee-deep snow, and what I saw made the back of my neck tighten. A German shepherd lay curled against the far side of the cage, its ribs showing through matted fur, patches of dark blood frozen along its flank. The dog was young, maybe 4 or 5 years old, but the exhaustion in its eyes made it look older. Its coat should have been the deep black and tan of a healthy shepherd, yet most of it was stiff with ice, clumped where wounds had dried. When the dog lifted its head, I noticed the slight tremor in its legs and the way it favored one paw, as if each movement cost more strength than it had left. "What the hell happened to it?" I asked. Kane shrugged, as if I had asked about a broken shovel. "Useless dog. Won't hunt, won't guard. Been trouble since I bought it." He stepped down from the porch, snow crunching under his boots, and stopped beside the cage. "Take it," he said. "Call it even for the repair." For a moment, the wind seemed to fade, and all I could hear was the faint rasp of the dog's breathing. In the teams, we learned to read small details quickly: the tilt of a rifle barrel, the tension in a man's shoulders before he reached for a weapon. That same instinct now studied the animal in front of me. The scars along its muzzle, the wary intelligence in its eyes, the way it watched Cain rather than me. This wasn't a useless dog. This was a dog that had been hurt enough times to expect it again. "You're serious," I said quietly. Cain's lips curved in a thin smile. "Take the dog or walk away, Walker. That's the deal." The shepherd shifted, trying to stand, but its legs buckled and it sank back into the snow. For a second, its gaze met mine. There was no growl, no bark, only a silent, stubborn refusal to give up even when the storm and the cage and the man beside it had already decided its fate. Something old stirred in my chest then, a memory of nights overseas when wounded teammates refused to leave anyone behind. I exhaled slowly and reached for the cage latch. The dog flinched but didn't bite when the door creaked open. "You're making a mistake," Cain said, already turning back toward his house. Maybe he was right. Taking in a wounded animal in the middle of a Montana winter wasn't exactly practical, but practicality had never been the reason men ran into gunfire to drag someone out. I crouched in the snow, letting the dog smell my gloved hand before gently slipping a blanket beneath its body. "Easy," I murmured. Its ears twitched at the sound of my voice. The wind howled across the yard, blowing snow between us like a curtain. I lifted the shepherd carefully, feeling how light it was, how fragile beneath the frozen fur. The dog's head rested briefly against my shoulder, and though it trembled, it didn't resist. Behind me, the ranch house door slammed shut. Cain was already gone. I carried the dog toward the small sled attached to my truck, laying it on the thick wool lining. The storm had grown stronger, snow swirling so densely it blurred the road leading back toward the forest. I tightened the ropes around the sled, pulled my hood down, and started walking. Pine Ridge disappeared behind me as the wind rose, the white darkness swallowing the ranch, the fences, and the man who had abandoned the animal beside them. The dog shifted slightly on the sled, breathing shallow but steady. I didn't know if it would survive the night. But as I leaned forward into the storm, dragging the sled toward the distant line of trees, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't leaving it there to die. The storm did not stop that night, and by the time I reached my cabin, the forest looked like a frozen ocean of drifting white. Snow clung to the tall pine branches until they bowed under the weight, and the narrow road leading to my place had already vanished beneath a smooth layer of wind-blown powder. I dragged the sled across the clearing and pushed the cabin door open with my shoulder. The inside smelled of wood smoke and old pine boards, a scent that had become familiar in the quiet years after I left the Navy. The German shepherd lay motionless on the sled for a moment, its chest rising slowly, as if it had already used up most of the strength it had left. When I bent down to lift it, the dog suddenly jerked its head up and bared its teeth. The growl that followed was weak, but unmistakably fierce. I stopped immediately. In the teams, hesitation could cost lives, but so could pushing too hard at the wrong moment. The dog's eyes were sharp even through the exhaustion, amber and alert, studying every movement I made. "Easy," I murmured, keeping my voice low. "You're safe here." The wind rattled the windows as another gust pushed snow against the walls. The dog did not believe me, and I couldn't blame it. A creature that had been locked in a cage and left to freeze did not simply accept kindness from strangers. I pulled a thick wool blanket from the chair beside the fireplace and laid it on the floor near the iron stove. The fire inside the stove glowed red, sending soft warmth into the small room. Instead of grabbing the dog again, I placed a metal bowl of water beside the blanket and stepped back. Slowly, carefully, I untied the ropes holding the sled in place. The dog watched every movement, its muscles tense, ears twitching at the crackle of the fire. When the ropes fell away, it hesitated before crawling out of the sled on its own. The limp in its right leg was worse than I had realized. Each step looked painful, yet it still tried to keep distance between us. It circled the blanket once before lowering itself to the floor, never taking its eyes off me. I sat down on the wooden chair across the room and leaned back, giving it space. Outside, the storm roared through the forest like a living thing, the snow tapping endlessly against the cabin walls. Hours passed that way. The dog never slept fully. Every time the fire popped or the wind shifted, its head lifted again. When I stood to place a small plate of cooked venison near the blanket, the growl returned instantly. "All right," I said quietly, sliding the plate a few inches closer before stepping away again. Hunger eventually won. After several minutes, the dog stretched its neck forward and sniffed the meat. Then it devoured it in seconds, licking the plate clean before retreating again to the far edge of the blanket. Watching it eat felt strangely familiar. During deployments overseas, I had seen soldiers behave the same way after long weeks in hostile territory. Quick movements, constant vigilance, eyes that never stopped searching for threats. "Guess we're both a little broken," I muttered to the room. By morning, the snowfall had grown even thicker. The windows were nearly buried, and the world outside looked like a blank white wall. I brewed coffee on the stove and watched the dog from the corner of my eye. It had not tried to escape during the night. Instead, it had chosen a spot beside the stove where the warmth reached the floorboards. When I approached with another bowl of water, the growl returned again, though softer this time. That was when I decided it needed a name. "Ranger," I said aloud, testing the word. The dog's ears twitched slightly. "Yeah, Ranger fits you." The name came from instinct more than thought. Every working dog I had known in the military carried that same quiet determination, the same refusal to quit. Ranger lifted its head when I spoke again, as if it recognized the tone even if it didn't trust the man speaking. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside to clear snow from the porch. The wind nearly knocked the shovel from my hands, and the sky above Pine Ridge was still heavy with dark clouds. As I worked, a pickup truck crawled slowly along the narrow forest road and stopped near the clearing. A woman stepped out, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. She walked carefully through the deep snow toward the cabin, her boots sinking almost to her knees. The woman was in her early 30s, tall and slender with chestnut brown hair pulled into a loose braid that hung over one shoulder. Her skin had the pale tone of someone who spent long winters indoors studying rather than working fields, and her green eyes were sharp and observant. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that suggested she was used to solving problems others avoided. When she reached the porch, she brushed snow from her coat and introduced herself. "Emily Carter," she said. Her voice was calm but curious. "I'm the veterinarian in Pine Ridge." I leaned the shovel against the railing. Didn't know the town had one. Emily smiled slightly. "Not many people do. Small clinic, mostly injured horses and the occasional barn cat." She hesitated before continuing. "Someone told me a former Navy SEAL dragged a wounded shepherd out of Victor Kane's ranch last night." I crossed my arms against the cold. "Word travels fast around here." "Animals in trouble tend to get my attention," she replied. There was no accusation in her tone, only concern. I opened the cabin door and stepped aside. "He's inside." Ranger was already standing when we entered. The dog's hackles rose instantly at the sight of the stranger. A deep growl rolled from its chest, stronger than the night before. Emily stopped a few steps away and crouched slightly, keeping her hands visible. "It's all right," she said softly. Her voice carried the steady patience of someone used to frightened animals. She studied the shepherd carefully, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the scars along its muzzle and the precise shape of its posture. Ranger did not attack, but it did not relax either. Emily slowly stood again, brushing snow from her gloves. "Ethan," she said quietly, without taking her eyes off the dog, "this isn't just a ranch dog." I felt a strange tension settle in the room. Outside, the storm continued to pound the forest. Emily finally turned toward me, her expression thoughtful. Then she looked back at the shepherd once more and spoke in a low voice that carried both surprise and certainty. "This dog has been trained." The storm never truly left Pine Ridge. Even days after Emily Carter first stepped into my cabin, the sky remained a pale iron gray, and snow drifted endlessly across the forest clearing. It fell quietly but relentlessly, covering footprints within minutes and softening every sound in the woods. Inside the cabin, the iron stove burned low and steady, its warmth barely pushing back the cold creeping through the old logs. Ranger lay near the hearth where the heat pooled on the floorboards, though his body remained tense even in sleep. Every so often, one of his ears twitched as if he were still listening for danger beyond the walls. Emily knelt beside him with careful patience, her movements slow enough that even a frightened animal would not see them as threatening. Up close, she looked younger than she had outside in the storm, though the tired lines beneath her eyes suggested long winters of hard work and worry. Her brown hair was tucked loosely beneath a wool cap, a few strands falling across her cheek, and her pale skin had the faint freckled tint of someone who had grown up in mountain sunlight before life pulled her indoors. She had told me earlier that she studied veterinary medicine in Colorado before returning to Pine Ridge to run the small clinic her late father once owned. The place struggled most winters, she admitted quietly, because ranchers often preferred to treat animals themselves rather than pay for help. Still, there was a stubborn kindness in her voice whenever she spoke about injured creatures. It reminded me of the medics I served with overseas, people who carried compassion into places most others avoided. Ranger stirred when Emily gently brushed a patch of frozen fur away from his neck. The growl came automatically, low and warning, but it faded as quickly as it had begun when he recognized her scent. That alone told me something had changed. The dog, who once snapped at every movement, now tolerated her presence, though his eyes remained sharp with caution. Emily leaned closer and parted the fur carefully along the back of his neck. "There," she murmured, pointing to a small raised shape beneath the skin. "That's what I thought." I stepped closer, crouching beside her. "What is it?" She pulled a small scanner from her medical bag, a handheld device about the size of a flashlight, scratched and worn from years of use. "Microchip reader," she explained. "Most working dogs get them now." Ranger stiffened again when the scanner touched his skin, but Emily kept her voice soft, almost soothing. "Easy, boy. Just a second." The device beeped quietly. Emily frowned at the small digital screen. For a long moment she said nothing, and the silence in the cabin felt heavier than the snow piling outside. Finally, she exhaled slowly. "I knew it." "Knew what?" I asked. She looked up at me, her green eyes reflecting the dim stove light. "This dog was military." The words settled into the room like another layer of falling snow. Ranger lifted his head slightly as if he understood the change in tone. Emily turned the scanner so I could see the code glowing on the display. "K9 registration," she said. "Older format, probably several years old." My gaze drifted back to the shepherd's scarred body, the missing patches of fur, the disciplined way he watched every movement, the refusal to panic even when injured. Suddenly, those details made sense. "He served," I said quietly. Emily nodded. "Looks that way." I reached out slowly, letting Ranger see my hand before touching him. His eyes followed the movement closely, but he did not snap. Under my fingers I felt the rough edges of old scars hidden beneath thick fur, the kind of wounds that came from barbed wire, shrapnel, or long deployments in rough terrain. I had seen similar marks on men who had spent too many years in war zones. A strange recognition stirred inside my chest. "You and me both, huh?" I whispered. Ranger watched me in silence. Outside, the wind rose again, pushing snow against the cabin walls in soft hissing waves. Emily sat back on her heels and rubbed her gloved hands together for warmth. "If that chip is still registered somewhere, we might be able to track where he came from," she said thoughtfully. "But the database might be outdated." Meaning? Meaning he might have been retired or abandoned. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I sat beside the dog for a long time, listening to the stove crackle. Memories from another life drifted through my mind. Patrol dogs moving silently beside soldiers in desert darkness, their handlers trusting them with lives. Those dogs were never treated like disposable tools. They were teammates. Ranger shifted slightly closer to the stove and rested his chin on the floor. His breathing slowed, but his eyes never fully closed. Emily began cleaning the wounds along his leg, using antiseptic from her bag. She worked carefully, speaking to him in the same calm tone she might use with a frightened horse. "You're tougher than you look," she told him softly. "But you've been through hell." Ranger didn't fight her. That alone felt like progress. Over the next hour, Emily stitched a shallow tear in his shoulder and wrapped the injured paw with fresh bandages. I watched quietly from the side of the room, noticing how steady her hands remained even when Ranger shifted suddenly. She had the patience of someone who understood fear without judging it. Eventually, the supplies were packed away and the cabin fell quiet again, except for the storm. Emily stood and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "He's going to need regular treatment if that leg is going to heal." "You don't have to," I replied automatically. She gave a small shrug. "Maybe not, but I want to." Ranger watched her cross the room toward the door, his ears tilting slightly forward. When she left, the wind rushed briefly into the cabin before the door shut again. I returned to the chair beside the stove and stared into the fire. The storm outside had grown thicker, the forest beyond the windows completely hidden behind drifting white. After a while, Ranger shifted closer to me, his injured leg moving stiffly across the wooden floor. I didn't move. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered himself beside the chair. Then, for the first time since I had pulled him from that cage, Ranger rested his head gently against my hand. Outside, the snow kept falling without pause. The storm never truly ended in Pine Ridge. It only shifted moods, sometimes roaring with violent wind, and sometimes falling in a slow, quiet curtain that made the forest seem like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. Weeks had passed since the night I carried Ranger out of Victor Kane's ranch, yet the sky remained heavy with snow, and the mountains beyond the valley stayed hidden behind drifting white clouds. My cabin had become a small island of warmth in that frozen wilderness. The iron stove burned almost constantly now, and the scent of pine smoke hung in the air as Ranger slowly recovered beside it. His wounds had begun to close under Emily Carter's careful treatment, though the limp in his rear legs still remained. Even so, I noticed something change in him once the worst of the pain faded. The wary tension never left his eyes, but the quiet alertness of a working dog had returned. One morning, while the snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, I stepped outside to check the tree line behind the cabin. The forest there stretched for miles into national land where hunters, hikers, and occasionally people with less honest intentions moved through the winter. Ranger followed me onto the porch, hesitating only briefly before stepping into the deep snow. His fur had regained much of its thick black and tan color, though faint scars remained along his muzzle and shoulder like faded lines of an old map. The cold didn't seem to bother him. In fact, the moment his paws touched the snow, his posture changed, his ears rising sharply as he began scanning the silent woods. I watched him move carefully across the clearing, nose low to the ground. The way he shifted through the snow reminded me of soldiers on patrol. Slow, deliberate steps, attention focused on details most people missed. "Go ahead," I muttered, adjusting my jacket. "Show me what you've got." Ranger trotted ahead along the narrow trail that led through the pine trees. Snow hung thick on the branches overhead, occasionally dropping in soft clouds as the wind shook the limbs. The deeper we moved into the forest, the quieter everything became. No engines, no voices, only the faint crunch of boots and paws. Ranger suddenly stopped beside a cluster of bushes buried beneath a drift. His head lowered, sniffing intensely. Then he stepped back and barked once. I knelt beside the spot and brushed away the snow with my gloves. Beneath the surface lay a steel wire loop anchored to a metal stake. A poacher's snare. "Damn," I murmured. The wire was strong enough to snap a deer's leg if it tightened. Ranger watched silently as I dismantled the trap and tossed the twisted wire aside. His tail flicked once, not with excitement, but with recognition, as though he had encountered this kind of thing before. We continued deeper into the forest. Before long, Ranger stopped again, pawing at another patch of snow. Another snare. And then another. Whoever had set them knew the trails animals used during winter migration. I removed each one carefully, anger building slowly in my chest. Poachers were nothing new in Montana, but the cruelty of those traps always bothered me more than most things. Ranger remained close beside me the entire time, his nose constantly scanning the air. Watching him work confirmed what Emily had suspected. This dog had been trained for detection and tracking. Later that afternoon, Emily arrived at the cabin again, her small pickup truck barely visible beneath layers of snow. She stepped out, wearing a thick green coat and fur-lined gloves, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Her boots sank deep into the clearing as she walked toward the porch. "Looks like you've got company again," she said with a tired smile when Ranger greeted her at the door. Ranger did not growl this time. Instead, he simply watched her carefully as she knelt to check the bandage on his leg. Emily brushed snow from her braid and glanced around the cabin. "You two look like you've been busy." I set the bundle of metal snares on the table. Her eyebrows rose slightly when she saw them. "Poachers," she said quietly. "Ranger found every one of them." She looked back at the shepherd with a new kind of respect. For a moment, her expression softened. "You know," she said, "when I moved back here after veterinary school, I thought Pine Ridge would be temporary." She spoke while replacing Ranger's bandage, her hands moving with practiced precision. "The clinic barely pays the bills most months. I've been thinking about leaving, maybe moving to Denver, where there are bigger hospitals." Ranger lay still during the treatment, though his eyes remained fixed on the door, as if guarding the room. Emily sighed softly. "But lately, I've been reconsidering." I leaned against the stove and folded my arms. "Because of him?" She shrugged slightly. "Partly. Animals like Ranger deserve someone looking out for them. And small towns, they need that too." Outside, the snow thickened again, swirling past the windows in slow drifting waves. Evening arrived quietly as the sky darkened beyond the trees. Emily finished her work and packed her supplies while Ranger rested near the stove. The fire crackled softly in the background. "He's healing faster than I expected," she said. "Another few weeks and that leg should be strong again." When she left, the night had already settled over the forest. Snow continued falling in steady silence. Ranger stood beside the door long after Emily's truck disappeared down the road. I assumed he was simply listening to the wind, but a few hours later, as I was adding wood to the stove, Ranger suddenly stiffened. His ears lifted sharply, a low growl rumbled in his chest. He walked slowly to the door and stared into the darkness beyond the frosted glass. The growl grew louder, deeper, directed toward the endless white forest outside. Night had settled heavily over Pine Ridge, but the darkness in the forest never felt completely empty. Snow continued falling without rest, thick flakes drifting endlessly between the tall pine trunks until the world outside the cabin looked like a shifting white wall. The storm had grown quieter compared to the roaring nights before, yet the silence carried its own kind of tension. Ranger stood beside the cabin door long after Emily's truck had vanished down the road earlier that evening. His posture was rigid, head angled towards the woods, ears lifted sharply. The low growl rolling from his chest was different from the warning sounds he used when strangers approached. This one was deeper, steadier, the kind of sound an animal made when it sensed a real threat. I had learned to trust instincts like that a long time ago. In the military, hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. If Ranger believed something was out there, I wasn't about to ignore it. I pulled on my heavy coat and stepped towards the door, grabbing the flashlight from the shelf near the window. Ranger shifted closer to me as I opened the door, his injured leg stiff but stronger than it had been a few weeks earlier. The cold rushed inside instantly, biting at my face as snow blew across the porch. The forest beyond the clearing looked endless and pale beneath the weak glow of the flashlight. Ranger stepped forward into the snow, his nose lifting slightly as he tested the air. Then I saw it. Two faint reflections glimmered between the trees about 30 yards away. Eyes. They remained perfectly still for a moment before shifting slightly in the darkness. Ranger's growl deepened. I lowered the flashlight beam slowly and recognized the shape emerging from the drifting snow. A mountain lion stood near the edge of the tree line, its muscular body barely visible beneath the falling flakes. The animal was large even for a cougar, its thick winter coat pale and dusted with snow. It moved with silent confidence, the way predators did when they knew they held the advantage. I had encountered mountain lions before while stationed in remote terrain during training exercises. They rarely attacked humans unless desperate or protecting territory, but winter could change that balance quickly. Hunger pushed animals into risks they might otherwise avoid. Ranger stepped slightly ahead of me, placing himself between the cabin and the predator. Snow clung to his fur, settling along his back and ears, yet he didn't move. His stance was firm, protective, almost deliberate. The mountain lion lowered its head slightly, watching us with the calm patience of a hunter deciding whether the effort was worth the fight. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and kept my voice steady. "Easy, boy." Ranger didn't look back, but his tail shifted once as if acknowledging the command. The cougar took one slow step forward. Ranger barked sharply, the sound echoing across the clearing and breaking the quiet of the storm. The lion paused again. For a long moment, neither animal moved. The falling snow thickened around them, swirling between predator and defender like a pale curtain. Finally, the cougar shifted its weight and turned its head slightly toward the deeper forest. It lingered only a second longer before slipping silently back between the trees, vanishing into the white darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Ranger continued staring at the spot long after the animal disappeared. Only when I placed my hand gently on his shoulder did he relax slightly. "You did good," I murmured. The warmth of the cabin felt stronger when we stepped back inside, though Ranger remained near the door for the rest of the night, as if guarding the boundary between us and whatever might be waiting beyond the snow. The following days passed quietly, though the story of the encounter spread through Pine Ridge faster than I expected. Small towns had their own way of carrying news from one porch to another. When Emily arrived later that week, She mentioned it with a hint of amusement in her voice. "You realize half the town thinks Ranger scared off a mountain lion single-handedly," she said, as she brushed snow from her coat and stepped inside. Ranger wagged his tail once when she knelt to check his leg. It was the first time I had seen that simple gesture from him. Emily's clinic had grown busier too. Word about the injured shepherd recovering in the forest had apparently reached ranchers across the valley. She told me about a rancher named Harold Briggs, who had brought in a sheepdog with a torn paw, and about a young couple who drove nearly 2 hours to have her examine their aging husky. Harold Briggs himself appeared one afternoon while I was loading firewood outside. He was an older man with a heavy build and a square jaw hidden beneath a thick white beard. Years of working cattle had carved deep lines into his weathered face, but his dark eyes held a quiet kindness. "You're the seal fellow," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Heard about that shepherd of yours?" Ranger stood beside me calmly, while Briggs studied him with approval. "Fine dog," the rancher added. "Looks like the kind that saves more trouble than it causes." Inside the cabin, Emily laughed softly when she heard the compliment. "Your dog might be the best advertisement my clinic ever had," she admitted. Despite the lighter mood, the weather outside told a different story. Each day, the snowfall thickened, and the wind began rising again in long, restless gusts that rattled the cabin windows. Ranger noticed it before any of us did. He spent more time watching the sky through the frosted glass, ears twitching whenever the wind shifted direction. One evening, as Emily prepared to leave, she paused on the porch and looked toward the distant mountains barely visible through the snow. Her expression turned thoughtful. "This storm system isn't normal," she said quietly. "The radio mentioned another front moving down from Canada." I followed her gaze across the valley. The clouds above Pine Ridge had darkened again, heavier than before. Even the forest seemed to brace itself beneath the growing wind. Ranger stood beside us, his fur already collecting fresh snowflakes as the first strong gust swept through the clearing. Somewhere beyond the white horizon, another storm was building, one far stronger than the one that had never truly ended. The wind arrived first, a restless growl moving through the forest long before the worst of the storm reached Pine Ridge. Snow had already been falling for weeks without pause, but that night the weather turned into something darker and heavier. The sky pressed low against the treetops, and the air carried a bitter cold that made even the pine branches creak under their burden of ice. Inside my cabin, the stove burned as hot as I could keep it, though the heat struggled to fight back the creeping chill that seeped through the old logs. Ranger had grown stronger during the past weeks, his injured leg healing enough that he could move around the cabin with only a faint limp. Still, the storm seemed to trouble him. He paced between the door and the window more than usual, stopping now and then to stare into the white blur outside as if trying to read something hidden in the falling snow. I had seen that behavior before in working dogs overseas. Animals often sense danger long before people noticed it. The wind slammed suddenly against the cabin walls, rattling the windows so hard the glass trembled in the frames. Ranger froze beside the stove, his ears lifting sharply. Another gust followed, stronger than the last, and somewhere beyond the cabin I heard the deep groan of wood under strain. Pine Ridge was used to storms, but this one felt different. Heavier, as if the entire forest had begun leaning under the weight of snow. I stepped toward the door to check the clearing. The moment I opened it, the wind nearly tore the handle from my grip. Snow blasted across the porch in thick white waves, so dense that the tree line had vanished completely. The storm had turned the world into a spinning wall of ice and wind. Ranger barked once behind me, a sharp warning sound. I closed the door quickly and added another log to the stove. "Easy," I muttered, though the words were meant as much for myself as for him. The storm continued to build hour after hour. By late evening, the entire cabin groaned under the pressure of the wind and snow piling onto the roof. The sound of branches snapping echoed faintly through the forest, carried by the gale. Ranger refused to settle. He stayed near the door most of the night, occasionally glancing back at me as if urging me to stay alert. Sometime after midnight, the noise outside grew even louder. The wind howled across the clearing with a deep, hollow roar, and I could hear the sharp cracking of trees somewhere close by. Ranger's head snapped toward the roof at the same moment I heard it, the long, splintering sound of wood breaking under strain. I barely had time to stand before the world above us collapsed. A massive pine tree, heavy with weeks of accumulated snow, had snapped at the trunk and crashed directly onto the cabin roof. The impact exploded through the building like a thunderclap. The ceiling beam shattered instantly, and the roof caved inward with a deafening crash. I felt something slam into my shoulder and knock me backward as wood and snow poured into the room. The force drove me against the floor, and a heavy beam pinned my legs beneath it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Snow and broken boards filled the air, and the wind roared through the hole where the roof had been. The cold hit instantly, sharper than anything I had felt all winter. Ranger barked frantically somewhere nearby. I tried to move, but the beam across my legs refused to shift. Pain shot through my side as I struggled against it. "Damn it," I gasped. The storm poured into the cabin now, snow swirling across the floorboards in thick drifts. Ranger appeared beside me, his body coated in white powder. He sniffed frantically at the beam trapping my legs, then began pawing at the snow and debris as if trying to dig me free. "It's too heavy," I muttered through clenched teeth. Ranger whined softly but didn't stop searching. The wind pushed through the broken roof relentlessly, filling the room with freezing air. Within minutes, my fingers had begun to lose feeling. I knew enough about winter survival to recognize the danger quickly. Hypothermia could set in fast under these conditions, especially if I remained pinned to the frozen floor. Ranger finally stopped digging and pressed himself against my chest instead. His thick fur was warm despite the snow covering it. He curled his body tightly along my side, shielding me from the worst of the wind pouring through the shattered roof. I placed one arm around his neck automatically. "Good boy," I whispered, my breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the wind carrying snow through the cabin like a blizzard trapped indoors. Time lost its meaning after that. Minutes blurred into something longer as I lay trapped beneath the beam. Ranger stayed pressed against me the entire time, refusing to leave even when the cold grew worse. Every so often he lifted his head and listened to the storm beyond the walls. In Pine Ridge, Emily Carter had begun to notice my absence. The storm had closed most roads through the valley, but she had still expected to see my truck at the edge of town earlier that day when she visited Harold Briggs' ranch to treat a lame horse. Emily had always been observant by nature, a trait sharpened during years of studying injured animals that could not speak for themselves. She was tall and slender, with steady green eyes that missed very little once something felt wrong. That evening, she sat alone inside her small veterinary clinic, staring through the frost-covered window as the storm worsened. The radio crackled with warnings about fallen trees and blocked roads. Ethan Walker hadn't come to town in several days, and the storm outside was only getting worse. Back at the cabin, the cold crept deeper into the broken room. Ranger suddenly lifted his head again, ears sharp as if listening for something far beyond the storm. Then he stood slowly and stepped away from me. For a moment, I thought he might finally run for shelter. Instead, Ranger walked toward the broken doorway where the blizzard poured into the cabin. He raised his head toward the storm-dark sky and let out a long, echoing howl that carried across the forest. The wind swallowed Ranger's first howl almost immediately, tearing the sound apart and scattering it through the forest like broken echoes, Yet he did not stop. Snow drove across the shattered cabin in relentless waves while the storm raged through the broken roof above me. I lay pinned beneath the heavy beam, every breath forming a thin cloud in the freezing air. My legs had gone numb long ago, and the cold had begun creeping deeper into my chest with each passing minute. Ranger stood near the doorway where the snow poured into the room. His body braced against the wind. Then he howled again. The sound rose higher this time, long and steady, a call meant to carry far beyond the clearing. It echoed across the frozen forest before the wind tore it apart once more. Still, Ranger continued, his voice cutting through the blizzard again and again, as if he understood that somewhere out there, someone might hear it. Miles away in the national forest, a patrol truck crawled slowly along a narrow service road that had nearly vanished beneath the snow. The vehicle belonged to the Pine Ridge Ranger Station, a small outpost responsible for maintaining the surrounding federal land. Inside the truck sat Daniel Harper, a forest ranger in his early 40s with a square jaw and thick dark beard that had begun turning gray along the edges. Daniel had spent most of his adult life working in the mountains, first as a search and rescue volunteer and later as a federal ranger. Years of winter patrols had given him the kind of patience that came from knowing nature never rushed for anyone. His eyes were sharp beneath the brim of his wool cap as he leaned forward over the steering wheel, studying the storm ahead. Beside him sat his partner, Luis Ortega, a younger ranger in his early 30s with olive skin and thick black hair tied back beneath a hood. Luis had once served as a firefighter in Arizona before moving north to Montana for a quieter life, though he quickly learned the mountains carried their own dangers. Both men were accustomed to storms, but even they had rarely seen one this relentless. The radio on the dashboard crackled with static as wind battered the truck. Daniel slowed the vehicle near a bend in the road. "You hear that?" he asked suddenly. Luis tilted his head, listening carefully beyond the roar of the wind. At first, there was nothing but the howl of the storm itself. Then, faint and distant, another sound rose through the snowfall. A dog's howl, long, echoing, persistent. Luis frowned. "That's not a coyote." Daniel nodded slowly. "No." The howl came again, carried faintly through the forest. It was distant, but clear enough to follow. Daniel shut off the engine and opened the truck door. The wind nearly ripped it from his hand as snow blasted into the cab. "Grab the lights," he said. Luis nodded and reached for the high-powered flashlights and emergency pack behind the seats. The two men stepped into the storm together, their boots sinking deep into the fresh drifts. The howl came again somewhere ahead of them, guiding their direction like a beacon. Back at the cabin, Ranger continued calling into the storm. Each howl carried desperation but also determination. Between calls, he returned briefly to my side, pressing his body against mine for warmth before moving back to the doorway again. I could barely keep my eyes open now. The cold had begun numbing more than just my legs. Sounds drifted in and out of focus, the roar of the storm blending with the distant echo of Ranger's voice. "Good boy," I whispered weakly. Time passed strangely after that. Minutes stretched endlessly while the storm continued hammering the forest. Then, through the haze of cold and exhaustion, I heard something different. A faint crunch of boots in the snow outside. Ranger's ears snapped forward instantly. The next moment, a beam of bright light pierced through the broken doorway, cutting across the drifting snow inside the cabin. "Over here!" a voice shouted above the wind. Ranger barked loudly in response. Two figures appeared at the doorway, their heavy winter coats coated in ice. Daniel Harper stepped inside first, his flashlight sweeping across the collapsed roof and shattered beams. Luis followed behind him carrying a small emergency pack. Daniel's eyes widened when he saw the beam pinning my legs. "Easy," he said quickly, kneeling beside me. His voice carried calm authority despite the chaos around us. "We'll get you out." Luis moved quickly to examine the collapsed structure above us. "Roof's unstable," he warned. "But the beam's not anchored anymore." Together, they braced themselves and lifted the heavy timber just enough for Daniel to pull my legs free. Pain shot through my body the moment the pressure lifted, but the relief of movement felt stronger. Ranger circled anxiously nearby, watching every motion the men made. "You're lucky that dog didn't stop howling," Daniel said as he helped me sit upright. "We would have driven right past the trail otherwise." Luis wrapped a thick thermal blanket around my shoulders, while Daniel secured the emergency radio from his belt. The storm outside continued to rage, but now there were voices inside the broken cabin, steady and reassuring. Ranger stayed close beside me as the Rangers helped me toward the door. The cold air outside hit my face sharply, yet the sight of the patrol truck's headlights glowing through the snow felt like the first real warmth I had felt all night. They guided me across the clearing carefully, one step at a time. As we reached the truck, another vehicle approached slowly through the storm. The driver's door opened before the engine even stopped. Emily Carter jumped out and ran through the snow toward us. Her braid had come loose beneath her hood, strands of brown hair whipping wildly in the wind. Her green eyes widened when she saw the damage to the cabin behind us. "Ethan!" she shouted, reaching my side as the Rangers helped me into the truck. Ranger climbed in beside me without hesitation. Emily's hands moved quickly across my shoulders, checking for injuries with the practiced calm of someone used to emergencies. Relief softened her expression when she realized I was conscious. Behind us, the broken cabin stood half buried in snow beneath the storm-dark sky. Word about the rescue spread quickly after that. Pine Ridge was the kind of town where stories traveled faster than vehicles during winter storms. By morning, nearly everyone in the valley had heard how a wounded German shepherd had howled through a blizzard until rescuers found a trapped man in the forest. The storm eased slightly in the days after the rescue, though the snow never stopped falling in Pine Ridge. It came down slower now, drifting softly through the gray sky, blanketing the town in a silence that seemed almost peaceful compared to the violence of the blizzard that had collapsed my cabin roof. I spent several days recovering in the small medical wing attached to the Pine Ridge Ranger Station, a modest building that served as both an office and emergency shelter during harsh winters. My ribs were bruised, and the doctor said I was lucky the beam hadn't shattered my legs entirely. Ranger never left my side during that time. The dog followed me everywhere with the quiet loyalty of a soldier who refused to abandon his post. He slept beside the narrow cot where I rested and watched the door whenever strangers entered the room. Word about the rescue traveled through Pine Ridge faster than the snowstorms themselves. People stopped by the ranger station with quiet curiosity, hoping to catch a glimpse of the dog who had howled through the blizzard and saved a man's life. One afternoon, Daniel Harper leaned against the doorframe while Ranger rested beside my bed. The ranger's beard was still dusted with frost from his patrol outside. "You've got a celebrity on your hands," he said, with a faint smile. I glanced at Ranger, who barely lifted his head at the comment. "He doesn't care about that." Daniel chuckled. "Maybe not, but people do." Among those visitors was Margaret Doyle, the owner of Pine Ridge's only general store. Margaret was a sturdy woman in her late 50s with short silver hair and bright blue eyes that always seemed to sparkle with humor. Years of running the town's busiest shop had made her both practical and endlessly curious about everyone around her. She arrived carrying a basket of homemade bread and stew. "For the hero," she said warmly, placing the basket on the small table beside my bed. Then she crouched to scratch Ranger behind the ears. "And for the real hero." Ranger tolerated the attention politely before returning to his quiet watch of the hallway. A few days later, Emily Carter helped me travel back to what remained of my cabin. The roof had collapsed completely, leaving half the structure buried beneath snow and splintered timber. Ranger moved carefully through the debris, sniffing the familiar scent of the place he had begun calling home. Emily stood beside me in the clearing, her green eyes scanning the damage thoughtfully. "We'll rebuild," she said simply. That was the kind of a person Emily had turned out to be. Beneath her calm voice and careful movements lived a stubborn determination that refused to abandon things worth saving. News about Ranger continued spreading through the valley. Ranchers spoke about him at the diner, and hunters mentioned the story while warming themselves near wood stoves. A dog who saved a man during the worst storm in years became the kind of tale small towns remembered for a long time. That was how Victor Kane eventually heard about it. The morning he returned to Pine Ridge, the sky hung low with heavy snow clouds again. Ranger and I were standing near the ranger station porch when a long black truck rolled slowly into the parking area. Even before the door opened, I recognized the shape of the man stepping out. Victor Kane looked exactly as he had the night I took Ranger from his ranch. Tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair combed neatly back despite the wind. His expensive coat contrasted sharply with the practical jackets worn by most people in Pine Ridge. His pale eyes settled immediately on Ranger. "Well," he said slowly, his voice smooth and measured. "So that's the dog everyone's talking about." Ranger's ears lifted the moment he saw Kane. The low growl that followed came instantly, deep and unmistakable. Kane ignored it as he approached, brushing snow from his gloves. "Seems my little problem turned out to be quite valuable, after all," he continued. I stepped forward slightly. "What do you want, Kane?" He gave a thin smile. "I came to correct a mistake." Kane reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, tapping it lightly against his palm. "Name your price. I'll buy the dog back." Ranger moved closer to my side, his body tense. I felt his shoulder press against my leg as if he understood the conversation. "He's not for sale," I said flatly. Kane's smile faded a little. "Everything's for sale, Walker." Behind us, the door of the ranger station opened. Emily stepped out onto the porch, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. Her eyes moved quickly from Kane to Ranger, immediately sensing the tension. A moment later, Daniel Harper appeared behind her, followed by Margaret Doyle and several other townspeople who had been inside the building. Pine Ridge was a small community. When trouble appeared, people tended to stand together. Kane noticed them gathering and let out a soft breath of annoyance. "I'm offering fair compensation," he said, holding the envelope out again. "That dog originally came from my property." "You left him in a cage to die," Emily said sharply from the porch. Kane glanced at her with mild irritation. "And now he's apparently famous." Ranger stepped forward suddenly, placing himself between Kane and me. His fur lifted along his back despite the falling snow. The growl deepened until it vibrated through the quiet air. Kane stopped walking. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his expression. Ranger did not bark. He simply stood there, muscles rigid, eyes locked on the man who had once abandoned him in the storm. Snow drifted slowly between them, thick white flakes settling across the clearing. No one moved. Finally, Kane lowered the envelope slightly. Ranger's growl echoed softly across the snow-covered ground as the storm continued falling around us. Snow continued to fall over Pine Ridge the morning after Victor Kane's visit, drifting down in steady white layers that softened the outlines of buildings and buried the roadways beneath fresh powder. The confrontation outside the ranger station had spread through town almost immediately, carried from porch to diner to store by people who had witnessed the exchange. In a place as small as Pine Ridge, news traveled as naturally as wind through the forest. I stood beside Ranger near the edge of the ranger station parking lot, watching the snow gather along the fence rails. Ranger seemed calmer now, though his posture remained alert. Every time a vehicle approached the road, his ears lifted slightly before settling again when no threat appeared. The dog had been through too much in his life to trust easily, yet the bond between us had grown stronger with each passing day. Emily Carter arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying a small metal case filled with veterinary equipment. Her breath formed pale clouds in the cold air as she crossed the snow toward us. She wore a thick wool coat that reached almost to her knees and heavy winter boots dusted with frost. Despite the early hour, her green eyes looked focused and determined, the same steady look she carried whenever she worked with injured animals. Emily had the quiet patience of someone who spent most of her life helping creatures who could not explain their pain. "Morning," she said softly, crouching beside Ranger. He sniffed her gloved hand and gave a small wag of his tail before returning his gaze to the road. "How's he doing?" she asked. "Better," I replied, still watching everything. Emily nodded thoughtfully. "That's normal for working dogs, especially ones that have been mistreated." Daniel Harper stepped out from the ranger station at that moment, carrying a small tablet device in one hand. The tall ranger brushed snow from his beard before approaching us. His expression carried the calm seriousness of someone who had spent the morning reviewing information. "I made a few calls last night," Daniel said, "about the microchip Emily found." Ranger lifted his head slightly when he heard the ranger's voice. Daniel held up the tablet so we could see the screen. Turns out that chip wasn't just old identification. It's linked to a military working dog registry. Emily's eyes widened slightly. So Ranger really was trained by the military. Daniel nodded. More than that. He scrolled through several lines of data before stopping on one entry. Name listed in the system: Ranger, German Shepherd, male, age 7, military K9 unit attached to a search and rescue detachment overseas. I looked down at the dog beside me. Ranger's thick black and tan coat was dusted with fresh snow, but beneath it I could see the powerful build of a trained working animal. Daniel continued reading. Records say he was injured during an operation 3 years ago and was officially retired from active service. The military transferred him to a private rehabilitation program afterward. Emily frowned slightly. Which means he couldn't legally belong to someone like Victor Kane. "Exactly," Daniel said. He tapped the screen again and pulled up a final document. Ownership was transferred to a veteran rehabilitation group in Montana that places retired working dogs with former service members. I felt a strange heaviness in my chest when I heard that. A dog trained for rescue work, injured during service, then passed through a system meant to help him find a proper home. Somewhere along the way, he had ended up locked in a cage on Kane's ranch. So Kane never had the right to claim him, Emily said quietly. "No," Daniel confirmed. "And once the paperwork gets updated, he won't have any legal ground to stand on." Later that afternoon, Victor Kane returned briefly to the ranger station, though this time the confidence he carried the previous day had faded. Daniel met him outside and presented the military registry records. Kane listened silently while snow fell around them. His sharp pale eyes moved from the documents to Ranger standing beside me. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally he exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the freezing air. "Seems I was misinformed about that dog," he muttered. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his truck. The vehicle disappeared down the snow-covered road a few minutes later, leaving the town quieter than before. After Kane left, Emily remained standing beside me near the edge of the clearing. Ranger sat between us, watching the drifting snowfall with calm attention. For a while, none of us spoke. Pine Ridge felt peaceful again now that the confrontation had ended. Emily broke the silence first. "You know," she said thoughtfully, There are a lot of animals around here that don't get second chances. I glanced at her. She brushed a few snowflakes from her coat sleeve before continuing. Dogs abandoned during winter, strays injured in traps, even working animals people stop caring about when they get old. Her eyes moved toward the ruined cabin visible through the trees. Your land out there could be the perfect place for something better. I studied her expression carefully. Emily rarely spoke about ideas without thinking them through first. "What kind of place?" I asked. She smiled slightly, though there was determination behind it. "A rescue center. Somewhere injured dogs could recover, somewhere retired working dogs like Ranger could live safely." Ranger shifted closer to my leg, as if listening to every word. I looked down at him for a moment before meeting Emily's gaze again. "You think people here would support that?" Emily nodded. "After what Ranger did for you, absolutely." Snow drifted quietly across the clearing while I considered the thought. My life since leaving the military had been mostly quiet and solitary, but the idea Emily suggested felt strangely familiar. A mission. A purpose. Something worth protecting. I reached down and rested a hand on Ranger's thick fur. The dog leaned gently against my leg, steady and loyal. "Maybe," I said slowly, "this is what we're meant to do now." I looked down at him and spoke quietly. "Looks like we've got a new mission, partner." Snow continued falling across Pine Ridge as winter settled deeper into the mountains, covering the forest in a thick white silence that seemed endless. Weeks had passed since Victor Kane drove out of town for the last time, and life in the valley slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The storm that once nearly killed me had left scars across the forest, broken branches and fallen trees buried beneath fresh drifts, yet something new had begun growing from the wreckage. The ruins of my old cabin still stood partially buried under snow when the idea Emily suggested started becoming real. Rebuilding the cabin alone would have been simple enough, but the plan quickly grew into something larger. The land around the clearing offered space, shelter from the worst winds, and access to the forest trails. It was the perfect place for what Emily had imagined. By early winter's end, the structure that rose in the clearing looked very different from the lonely cabin that once stood there. The new building was longer and stronger, reinforced with thick timber beams and a wide-covered porch facing the forest. Behind it stood several fenced enclosures built with heavy wooden posts, each lined with insulated dog shelters that could protect animals from the brutal mountain cold. A wooden sign hung near the entrance gate, freshly carved and painted in dark letters. Ranger's Haven Rescue. Ranger had watched the entire construction process with quiet curiosity. The German Shepherd moved among the workers calmly, his black and tan coat bright against the snow. Though he still carried the scars of his past, his strength had returned fully, and his confident stride reminded everyone that he had once been a military working dog. Sometimes he would sit beside the gate and observe the activity like a silent supervisor, occasionally wagging his tail when someone greeted him. Many of the people who helped build the rescue center were townsfolk from Pine Ridge. Daniel Harper brought lumber from fallen trees cleared during ranger patrols. Margaret Doyle organized food for the volunteers from her general store kitchen. Ranchers arrived with tools, and several teenagers from town spent weekends helping assemble fencing around the enclosures. Even the quietest members of the community found ways to contribute. One of those people was Thomas Green, an older carpenter who lived on the far edge of Pine Ridge. Thomas was a thin man in his late 60s with deeply lined cheeks and gray hair tied loosely behind his neck. His hands were rough from decades of woodworking, yet his movements remained careful and precise. Years earlier, he had lost his own dog during a harsh winter storm, and the memory had shaped his quiet personality ever since. When Thomas heard about Ranger's story, he arrived one morning with a toolbox and offered to help rebuild the porch. He rarely spoke while working, but the craftsmanship of the porch beams and railings soon became one of the most beautiful parts of the new building. Emily Carter became the heart of the rescue center. Not long after the construction began, she moved from her small veterinary clinic apartment into a modest cabin just down the trail from the rescue grounds. Her new home was simple but warm. With a narrow porch and a small barn she converted into a treatment room for injured animals. Emily worked tirelessly each day, checking on the dogs, cleaning wounds, and organizing supplies. Her long brown hair was usually tied back in a loose braid while she worked, and despite the cold, her cheeks were often flushed from constant movement between the kennels and the clinic room. The first animals to arrive at Ranger's Haven came quietly, almost cautiously, as if the valley itself had been waiting for such a place to exist. A rancher brought an old shepherd mix whose leg had been injured in a trap. A traveling truck driver left behind a stray husky found wandering along the highway. Daniel Harper delivered a frightened young border collie discovered alone in the forest after a snowstorm. Each dog carried its own story of hardship, and each one found a warm shelter waiting behind the wooden fences. Ranger adapted to his new role with surprising ease. He moved through the rescue center calmly, greeting new dogs without aggression, and sometimes sitting beside the most frightened ones until they relaxed. The training he received during his military years seemed to shape everything he did. When new arrivals came in frightened or injured, Ranger often lay quietly nearby as if offering silent reassurance that this place was safe. The bond between him and the other animals slowly became the quiet spirit of the rescue center. Winter continued to stretch across the mountains, and snow still fell nearly every day, drifting gently through the pine branches surrounding Ranger's Haven. Yet the place felt warmer than any building I had lived in for years. One evening, near sunset, Emily joined me on the porch after finishing her rounds through the kennels. Several dogs rested inside their shelters while others played slowly in the snow-covered yard. Ranger lay at my feet, watching them with calm attention. Emily leaned against the porch railing, brushing snowflakes from her coat sleeve. "You ever imagine this happening?" she asked quietly. I shook my head, not even close. For years after leaving the Navy, I had lived quietly, drifting through days without much purpose beyond surviving winter after winter in the forest. But watching the rescue center now, the dogs sleeping safely in their shelters, the lights glowing warmly inside the building, the sound of life returning to the clearing, I realized how much had changed. Ranger lifted his head and looked up at me, his steady, brown eyes reflecting the soft porch light. I reached down and scratched behind his ears the way Margaret Doyle always did. Snow continued falling beyond the porch, blanketing the forest in thick white silence, just as it had the night I found him trapped in that cold metal cage. Yet this time the cold felt different. I leaned back in the wooden chair and watched the snow drift through the pine trees. Ranger rested his head against my boot. For the first time in many years, the winter around Pine Ridge no longer felt empty. Sometimes the greatest miracles in life do not arrive with bright light or loud signs. Sometimes they come quietly in the middle of a storm, when everything feels cold, broken, and hopeless. A wounded dog left to die in the snow became the reason a man found purpose again, and a lonely cabin in the forest became a home for many lives that needed warmth. Perhaps that is how God often works in our lives. He places small, unexpected moments in our path, moments that test our compassion and remind us that kindness can change more than we ever imagine. Every act of mercy can become the beginning of something larger, something that spreads hope far beyond the place where it started. If this story touched your heart today, please share it with someone who may need a reminder that goodness still exists in the world. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what part of this story meant the most to you. And if you believe stories like this matter, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue sharing more true stories of courage, compassion, and second chances. May God watch over you, protect your family, and fill your days with warmth and peace no matter where you are listening from today.